Hello everyone and welcome to the Wondering Christians. So in this episode, we are going to be looking at a very interesting question that is often mentioned when talking to atheists or agnostics. And that question is religion good or bad for the world?
I think we can look at this question in two steps. I guess, is religion good or bad for the world? We can look at the good side and the bad side. I think there are two sides to this question, and both people that attack this question have good answers, or good theories and good reasoning behind them. But if we look at this question as a whole, I think we can reach some kind of a conclusion. At least I have reached some kind of a conclusion, so let's go at it. Firstly, we can start by defining religion, and this is important for the rest of the episode. So we can define it by my personal definition that I just created is an organized group that has rituals and traditions and sponsors metaphysical beliefs and doctrines. Do you agree with that simple definition?
Very good, yeah. It might be a good idea to actually just go over a few of the definitions of religion that can be found within dictionaries.
Okay.
So the first one is a set of beliefs concerning the cause, nature and purpose of the universe, especially when considered as the creation of a superhuman agency or agencies, usually involving devotional and ritual observances and often containing a moral code governing the conduct of human affairs. Number two, a specific fundamental set of beliefs and practices generally agreed upon by a number of persons or sects. Personally, number two is the one I would say I align closest to, being the specific fundamental set of beliefs and practices generally agreed upon by a number of persons or sects. Number three, the body of persons adhering to a particular set of beliefs and practices. I agree with that one as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, they get pretty silly, really. The life or state of a monk, nun or whatever, and just goes down that path.
But I think they all touch on these three principles, which is there's some sort of group identity, sect, group of people. They involve a belief, and doctrines and moral code, and then they involve rituals, some kind of ritual, tradition, practice.
Sure. Just diving into it, I think when a person is asked, is religion good or bad, especially in the Western world, I think they're usually automatically referring to Christianity specifically.
Well, nowadays I think Islam's pretty entrenched in here as well. But normally, Christianity.
Yeah. So I think because there are so many different things upon which you could say is religion in the world, the answer is not yes or no. There are, of course, some groups upon which have, especially historically, incited violence, and that is specifically within their scriptures or upon what they believe. Then again, on the other side of the coin, there are what you could call pacifist groups, upon which do not promote violence in the slightest bit possible. Mm-hmm. So if you were to attempt to straight up answer the question, is religion good or bad for the world? I believe it would be wrong to answer it as a yes or a no. I think the question itself has to be restructured into a more proper context.
Okay, so like a specific religion or something?
Yes.
Yeah, that's the best way to get an answer that actually has some kind of meaning, because if you just ask, is religion good or bad, there's some things that are held by all religions, which were the definitions that we read, and we can try and say if that's good or bad, but in a practical sense, you're not going to be dealing with a religious person necessarily. You're going to be dealing with a Christian or a Muslim or Jew or Buddhist. So that's definitely a more practical way to go about it.
I think at this point, we have very briefly shown that the question, is religion good or bad for the world, far too abstract.
Well, it is a bit too abstract, but there is, I think, there's still purpose in that, because there is a sense in which there's a thing which is, or phenomena, which is religious thinking. Okay, so I think all religious people think in a religious way when it comes to a lot of subjects. And I think a lot of the atheists, I was looking online just before this, and listening to Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins. And they were bringing up this argument. Some of them were speaking against a certain religion, which was Islam, which is one of the easier religions to attack when talking about is religion good or bad for the world. But they were definitely also talking about this religious mindset of having faith in something that supposedly doesn't show any evidence, and having faith in believing in things that you don't have evidence for.
It would be far easier to answer this question as it is currently presented if all religions promoted the death of certain children or promoted killing or rape consistently, and they offered nothing good to help or build or to lead man to salvation.
Mm-hmm.
However, that is not the case, as we should really know, whether that be through Buddhism, Christianity, Sikhism, and the like. Anyway, if you want, what is the point that you want to raise?
So going back to the three tenets that I saw in those definitions and I put in my own, which is it's an organized group, sect, group of people, whatever, that has rituals and traditions, and it has metaphysical beliefs and doctrines. So metaphysical would be, about God, about the ideal world, stuff like that. And they have beliefs and doctrines about that. If we look at that definition, it has three aspects, and if we go through those three, and I wanted to point out some bad things and then some good things, and then give some sort of answer about those, an opinion. So for the bad, I think we can all think about how a group identity can be bad. It can create certain divisions in societies that don't need to be there, and certain fights that don't need to exist. So let's say there's a construction of some church or temple or mosque or whatever, and a certain group is pushing for the construction of that mosque. For example, after 9/11, there was a mosque that was going to be built somewhere near where the towers fell, the Twin Towers fell, and maybe if there didn't exist if religious belief wasn't that strong, people wouldn't care if that mosque was being built. But there was a huge controversy of Christians saying that we shouldn't build the mosque there, it's disrespectful, and then Muslims saying, no, but we have the right to build there, that's discrimination, not all Muslims are, terrorists. Well, so it does. So creating group identity, it does create certain divisions that don't need to be there. And from an atheist perspective or secular person's perspective, it definitely doesn't need to be there because they're supposedly make-believe problems, right? Okay, but then again, we do have countries and we do have group identities that we do accept. The second part is religions have, or these groups have these groups have rituals and traditions, and these rituals and traditions can be abusive, firstly, okay, and they can push people to some sort of action or whatever. Let's say, I think notorious situations are Catholic schools, or maybe they don't have to be Catholic. I don't want to pick on them, but I guess there's a stereotype of Catholic schools, the teachers being pretty aggressive to the students. And the discipline being super high. I guess that's how it just used to be back in the day, but a lot of it can come from religion, and also the whole situation with priests. Those traditions and rituals can come from that. And I guess there's also a thing to be said against having rituals that aren't real. They don't have any real impact in the world. There's something against that as well. This is the old critique against religion, which is it's the opium of the masses. It's the drug that people take to, calm down their fears or whatever. And a danger is that it can stop people from facing their problems. And if people just resort to some impotent ritualistic type of devotion or prayer, they can run away from their problems and let their societies fade away. But again, this all depends on which religion you talk about, but in a sense, religious thinking can promote that. And then thirdly, metaphysical beliefs and doctrines, they can also be bad. They can turn into violence or anti-human behavior. An obvious example is holy wars or even terrorism. Religion can give, and it does give reasons, it does give reasons for evil people to do evil things. So evil people can use religion to substantiate their evil actions. So we saw this in the Holy Wars in the medieval ages. We saw this in the conquering of the New World. A lot of it was religious, terrorism on the Native Americans and in Africa, etc. And modern day terrorism, be it Muslim terrorists or Catholic or Protestant terrorists, for example, in Ireland or whatever, don't exist as much now, but did exist 50 years ago. However, I guess religion is only just a part of a series of reasons people can have to push their evil agenda and take, certain bad or evil, destructive actions. There are a whole number of things that push people to do these types of things. So class fights, so upper class versus lower class, races. There's been fight between races that have nothing to do with religion, a lot of them. World War II, some of that is in the Holocaust is an example of that. And there's nations just versus nations. World War I, for example, which is just random fights between nations. And then there's also some violence or aggressiveness between genders or generations or philosophies. All these bad things that religion can do, a lot of it can come from other places too. And I think every person in the world can agree that it's not just irrational. Irrational beliefs don't come solely from religion. They come from other ideologies too, be it communism, capitalism. Nowadays, there's a big fight all over the world. In the past 100 years, there's been big fights all over the world about these things, and it's ideological. And some people, they're very rational in some opinions, and then on many things, they can be scientists or whatever, yet they have super strong ideological beliefs about certain things that have nothing to do with religion. And you can't change their mind through reason a lot of the time. The belief that reason pushes everyone to some sort of equal belief in the same thing, that's not true.
That's absolute nonsense, yeah.
Yeah, so ideologies do still control people outside of religion. And we saw that the 20th century was the culmination of that between, I guess, World War I was more just a fight between nations and their alliances that they had built. But World War II was ideology full on, and the Cold War was super, super ideological, probably the most ideological war we've ever had.
Also, as we're Christians, I'm just going to flat out say it as well, not all religions or faiths are correct. Some are almost completely wrong, and there's only one that is correct, and that is Christianity and followers of Christ. Some other religions and some other faiths have elements of truth to them. However, their true belonging is within Christianity, and these truths have been revealed to these people in these other religions as self-evidence of God's being, the Christian God's being. The second point I want to make as well is that there are indeed events in history, or presently, that are done in the name of a religion, or in the name of a faith, such as Christianity. One that is often raised with me is the Crusades. Critics often mention the Crusades as evidence for the violence of Christianity. And although we can readily admit that the Crusades, the Inquisition and Europe's religious wars, were indeed a tragedy that they happened / perhaps needed to happen, or people felt like they needed to happen, they often take the event and as in the critics often take the event and then immediately presume that the tradition of which these people follow commands such things to happen, which simply isn't true. In other words, for example, do the Crusades or do the Inquisitions, do they reflect the essence of Christianity? Again, questions are raised such as, what do we mean by religion in regards to every religion that has ever existed? As I was saying, the religion-war connection assumes that religion has little connection to truth. Any unique, authentic, honest-to-goodness divine revelation doesn't even come upon the critic's radar screen when such matters are raised. Those who often critique, and I'm going to specifically target the Crusades now, do lump it with something like Islamic Jihad, which is a massive mistake. And I'm only spend some time listing some of the general reasons as to why that is a mistake. You see, the Arabic term jihad, I believe, literally means struggle, which can mean the inner intellectual or moral struggle, as well as a malicious or violent struggle. However, traditionally and through the past, it has been known as a militant/violent struggle. And it doesn't take you very much history lesson to realise that jihad is all throughout Islamic history, pretty much since the beginning, as well as there's little support for jihad as a mere spiritual/internal struggle. So if we compare the crusade with a militant, aggressive Islamic jihad, the Crusades come out looking considerably better anyway. So, for example, the Crusades lasted about 200 years on and off, whereas jihad in Islam has been ongoing for more than 1,300 years. Or the Crusades have been criticised as the beginning of imperialism, whereas Muhammad's imperialistic jihad expeditions began more than 500 years prior to the Crusades and even continue today. The Crusades began as an effort to recapture from Muslim lands once occupied by Christians, and jihad began with the intent to take Christianized territory never occupied by Muslims to establish what in Islam is called the Ummah, which translates to Islamic community. Yet again, Jesus, in whose name the Crusades were fought, did not teach or exemplify violence against those who refused his message, whereas in jihad in Islam, Muhammad not only preached violence against non-believers, but also engaged in it himself in over 60 aggressive military campaigns. That is as if the Muhammad in the Quran even existed. The earliest followers of Jesus and those who wrote the New Testament didn't advocate violence. In its earliest centuries, the politically powerless Christian faith expanded through deeds of love and communicating the life-changing news of Christ, whereas, finally, the Quran includes many militant, aggressive texts. After Muhammad's death, Islam was extended far and wide through violence. It overran previously Christianized areas and regularly posed a threat to establish Christendom via places like Spain, France, or Greece or Vienna. And those are just some examples of just lumping things in with each other. Do you understand where I'm coming from?
Definitely.
So for example, although the Crusades were fought in Jesus' name, nowhere in the Gospels does Jesus specifically state to do these things. In fact, the history of the early church condones violence totally. Whereas in the Quran, on the other hand, violence is actively encouraged. And if you actually look at history, whether you look at the northern historical narrative of Islam or whether you look at the southern Islamic narrative of Islam, both ways you get actively encouraged violence, and this is shown within the Quran. So it is, I would argue that it is definitely right to argue that Islam is very much a violent-leaning religion, whereas Christianity is very much a more peace-leaning religion.
Yeah, I think at least, well, the followers of Islam now, at least in the Western world, they've been westernized a bit. I think that's safe to say. And I think that a lot of them would probably say that as well, and have become a lot less violent. I think a lot of this talk about violence and non-violence is actually, it's also a fruit of where people live. Not just a geographical location, but the societies that they live in. Because Christianity before was pretty until Christianity is not it's an idea. But religious countries or peoples, Christian peoples, were violent until a few hundred years ago, because of their religion. They used their religion as violence until a couple 100 years ago. But with this more enlightenment type of thinking, this more liberal type of thinking, I think that's changed a bit. I think most religions are influenced as well by their society. So you can see a lot of Muslims not practicing maybe the violence that's set out as an example by their prophet, Muhammad, or by their holy book. But yeah, there is definitely a distinction between religions. And I think out of all the religions, the one that's had the most history with violence has probably been the ones that have had the most political power. I think that can also be correlated pretty easily. I think Islam, it's had a lot of power in the Middle East, and it's fought a lot of wars in Spain, in Portugal, in Turkey, and it moved into Greece, and etc., etc. But also Christianity, it's had loads of power, and it's as a religion, and it's proved to be also, the people have proved to use it as violence. But then again, if you look at the books themselves, they don't necessarily teach violence. At least Christianity doesn't as much. But again, so we need to also talk about this issue with the Old Testament, which is what a lot of people bring up.
Okay, so I am aware that I actually stated that it was the Gospels that don't specifically teach or encourage violence and so on. Those who are knowledgeable about the Old Testament will know that God instructed the Israelites to go on let's call them Yahweh wars. So wars given by God or commanded by God to have the Israelites go into the Canaanites and drive them out, or the Amalekites, for example. Again, regarding these wars, I am once again going to do a lovely comparison with Islamic Jihad. So, for example, regarding the geographic objectives of the wars of Yahweh, as we will call them, war was very much geographically limited to the boundaries of the Promised Land, whereas in Islamic Jihad, there are no geographic limitations to jihad. The non-Muslim world is indeed the abode to war. Now, a second category that we can look it up in is in regards to the historical length of these wars. In the Yahweh wars with the Israelites, such a war was limited primarily to one generation, this being around the time of Joshua, though minor conflicts obviously continued with persistent enemies of Israel. In Islamic Jihad, there are no historical/temporal limitations to jihad. Again, regarding the objectives of war, the Yahweh war was to punish a hopelessly corrupted culture morally and theologically, not because they were non-Israelites or even because they didn't worship Yahweh. This punishment came after a period of over 400 years when the Canaanite sin had ripened fully. Man, that must be bad. But you've got to remember as well that when the Israelites went away from God and their sin themselves had ripened, they too were driven out by people like the Babylonians. Again, when compared with the Islamic Jihad, the aggression/war is directed towards non-Muslims, including Jews and Christians. So anybody who is not Muslim is basically inferior. The Islamic tradition effectively states that once the entire world is Muslim, I particularly had a Muslim tell me this, that once the entire world is Muslim, there will be no more wars and there will be peace and the world will be a perfect place. Look at what the Muslims have at the moment. Are those places peaceful? No. So what makes them think, if they cannot control this amount of land that they have at the moment, that when they take the entire world it will be safe? Now again, the fourth category to look at is the objectives of all the objects of God's love. In the Yahweh wars, Yahweh loves even his enemies or those who don't love him. His redemptive plan encompasses the traditional enemies of Israel, whether that be Babylon, Assyria, Egypt, Persia, the Canaanites, and incorporates them into the people of God. Whereas in Islamic Jihad, God only loves those who love and obey him. He has no interest for anybody else. And then finally, in regards to the standard of morality, in the Yahweh wars, God's compassionate and gracious nature is the source of God's commands. Whereas in Islamic Jihad, the Quran stresses God as sheer will, as opposed to a morally good nature who commands whatever he likes. Now, do you see where I'm coming from again? Just to go into a bit more, there's another category of fulfilling God's plan. The Messiah's kingdom is to be characterized by peace. In the New Testament, Jesus' task is to undermine the true enemy, Satan, the all-deceiving one, the father of lies, as well as his hosts, not Israel's political enemies. Whereas in Islamic Jihad, Muhammad's military aggression is viewed by many Muslims as normative, which sets back the clock on what the Messiah came to fulfill, undermining God's ultimate purposes. Now note this, as traditionally understood, the Quran's tolerant verses are earlier and thus outweighed by the later more valiant verses. as you'll know, is commonly known as abrogation. In Islam, is that when God changes his mind, it's abrogated. And now we have the normativity of war within the Yahweh war. Fighting against Canaanites was not intended to be normative and ongoing, having the force of divine commands, but unique. God has a non-nationalistic covenant in mind for his people. Whereas, finally, in Islamic Jihad, the military aggression of Muhammad, supported by the Quran's militarism, Islam's aggressive history, and present political realities in the Muslims' countries, suggests an intrinsic pattern. Now, what I hope to have demonstrated through reading these things is, in regards to the Crusades and Islamic Jihad, that what is done in the name of religion, in Christianity's case, is not necessarily what that tradition states as what one should do. But I've also stated that when wars are commanded, they are commanded for a morally good purpose by God.
Which religion?
Christianity here, referring to the Yahweh wars of the Old Testament. Whereas but now you've answered that, I'll say it again. In regards to Islam, however, what we find is throughout the Quran, not only does it consistently breach the laws of Moses and mock the true faith of Christianity, but the pain and suffering that is inflicted by people is for political purposes. It's not only for political purposes, but it's also because supposedly that their so-called God commanded it, and this war has no end. Even today, it should be the case that anyone who is not Muslim, any nation that is not Muslim, that is an abode of war. Not only this, but the wars that are stated should be in line with the morality that God has stated as well, I believe. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I think I do. I don't know too much about Islam, so I can't speak to that, but I can for the Bible. The argument is pretty clear, solid, without fault, which is the New Testament. I think most people would agree that there's no call to violence, and there's a very strong call to anti-violence and no creation of wars. However, in the Old Testament, and which is what opponents of Christianity point to when trying to argue for Christianity being bad for the world in terms of violence and wars, you have to look at the Old Testament people as a country. They were a country, they had their borders, and God was the God of Israel, and he would order wars to protect the country and protect its borders, as any nation would now. So those are the types of violence in the Old Testament. There are exterminations of people, and God does have the right to do that, either in Islam or Christianity, but they're always specific to the nation of Israel, which doesn't really exist now in the way it did.
Careful in regards to the extermination of people, because I presume you're talking about people like the Amalekites or the Canaanites.
Sure. I can't remember their names, but yeah.
Right, so let me put it this way. If you heard that your favourite football team had been absolutely slaughtered by the opposing team, and then it was an absolute massacre, would you run out your front door, tear your clothes, go to your knees and scream, "No!" into the sky, thinking that the opposing football team has come onto the pitch, pulled out machine guns from their underwear and gunned everybody down?
Well, no.
No, you wouldn't, would you? Because you just go, oh gosh, okay, so my team just got badly beaten. 7-0 or something, right?
Yeah.
And that is can be known in a way as hyperbole. What we find in many historical manuscripts, such as those of, I think it's Ramses II, one of the Egyptian pharaohs, as well as in many other places that I can't remember those at the moment. You quite often get, after a battle, a documentation saying how for example, this Egyptian pharaoh had dashed his enemies across the rocks, how he had left no man standing, and how it was an absolute total wipe-out victory for them, that no man, woman or child was left standing. Now, we know through historical evidence that this battle that he is talking about, again, sorry, I apologise, I forget the name of the battle, that this was by no means a total wipe-out. It was, in fact, very much more of a stalemate. What this manuscript was saying is he'd completely annihilated his enemies. Well, no, the truth is he hadn't. It was much closer than that. If anything, it was a Pyrrhic victory, and yes, there were still women and children standing and alive. And we find the same pattern throughout many other ancient manuscripts where, it hasn't been a total victory. It's been much more of a Pyrrhic victory or a stalemate, but they've just gone back and bragged about it nonetheless.
Mm-hmm.
And 2, no, women and children weren't really involved. It was mainly men. It was on a battlefield.
Yeah, but this is the Bible, so the Bible it's not lying when they say that God told them to kill, when God says, tells the Israelites to kill everyone and the children, the animals. That is really God telling them to do that. Right.
But then, for example, the Amalekites, I believe, appear back in, I think it's, they go through and the king remains alive, but then Samuel kills the king of the Amalekites, but then they reappear again in chapter 30. So they've by no means been totally wiped out. They've just, I think here is a point of discussion at this point where I think it was the prophet Samuel telling Saul these things, and so it could have been maybe hyperbole, I don't know. But my point is they weren't all wiped out. They appeared again later on. It's the same with the Canaanites. The Canaanites were definitely not totally annihilated. Not only does the Bible specifically state that, but it also states that it was actually a far more... I think when people look at the Canaanites, they often think that Israel's ran in there with all these swords, massacred everybody, and then took it all over for themselves in one swift swoop. That was by no means the case. What you actually find, not only through historic evidence, but also through scripture, is that it was actually a far more gradual process. And the Israelites did move in, and obviously the Israelites did just become the more dominant culture. And in the UK, we have something called white flight, when foreign people come and live in the towns, and the culture changes, and then the native white people move out. Mm-hmm, yeah. Effectively, the same thing happened with the Canaanites. Mm-hmm. Yes, there were conflicts with the Canaanites. However, consistently throughout, the Canaanites are always there. They're never fully annihilated. In fact, I believe God even states his hope of redeeming the Canaanites, or foreign peoples. And so actually, when we stop looking at it like a Sunday school kid with that kind of detail and that taking it literally, mm-hmm. and we actually look in deeper and we look at historical evidence and we take a moment, things can become a bit clearer in that regard.
But nowadays, if we're going to make distinctions between religions, at least in Christianity and some other religions, it doesn't have that call for violence, and it does fight against that, and it's why there's the reasoning why slavery was stopped for the first time in human history and all those things. But the Old Testament, it's definitely for another time, for another people. It wasn't written for Christians. It was Christ. There wasn't a Christ back then. At least for Christianity, I can have a justified belief that my religion doesn't call for violence, and it doesn't have that bad aspect in it, at least.
We've been talking quite a lot of the bad of religion and trying to defend what could be perceived as bad within Christianity. However, I'd like to actually raise a few points of the good, again, specifically within Christianity. Christians throughout history have contributed heavily on many fantastic feats, mm-hmm. such as eradicating slavery, opposing infanticide and rescuing infants from exposure, ancient abortion. So if the Romans didn't want their children, they just dump them out, their freshly born babies, out on their own doorsteps to be exposed to the natures until they die, and Christians would actually come along and take these infants and adopt them. Christians played a big role in eliminating gladiatorial games, which often involved slaves and criminals, and they were outlawed in the late 4th century in the Eastern Roman Empire and the early 5th century in the West, as well as just building hospitals and hospices. Unlike Greeks and Romans, early Christians were concerned about healthcare, looking after the sick and the dying. The Council of Nicaea commissioned bishops to actually establish hospice care in every city where a church building existed. Actually, the first hospital was built under Saint Basil in Caesarea in 369 AD. And of course, by the Middle Ages, hospitals existed throughout Europe. Mm-hmm. And of course, Christians contributed greatly in the elevation of women's statuses and rights in society. It's a very big argument today that from feminists claiming that the Christian faith puts women down and keeps them under history actually shows the opposite. Though women have been routinely oppressed in most cultures, we see something completely different in Jesus' treatment of women. So think about the Samaritan woman or Mary and Martha. Luke's gospel specifically highlights the prominent place of women in Jesus' life and ministry. Early Christians routinely protected women and children from neglect and abuse, and this is also shown within the Old Testament as well, within the laws of Moses. We also have the Christians contributed greatly to the foundings of Europe's and North America's great universities, such as the Sorbonne, Oxford, Harvard, Yale and Princeton, as well as the University of Paris. I think I told you before about how really the earliest university kind of like institutions were known as cathedral schools or monastery schools, which are very much interested in the arts subjects. And as well as this, writing extraordinary works of literature, engaging in / writing about philosophy and theology and the life of reason, such as people through Augustine of Hippo, Anselm of Canterbury, Thomas Aquinas, and so on. The contribution to art and sculpting and architecture, the establishing of modern science with its roots in the biblical conviction that the world was created by a rational God. For this reason, it was orderly and predictable, and it could be studied and understood by human minds. Some great people to mention here would be Isaac Newton, Galileo, Nicholas Copernicus, Johannes Kepler, Michael Faraday, William Kelvin, Robert Boyle, so on. Some fantastic composers, as well as the Christian drive for the advocacy of human rights, democracy, political freedoms, concern for the poor, all of these themes being rooted in the biblical ideals that all humans are made in God's image, that they have dignity and worth, and that they are equal before the law. Both man and woman are equal before the law.
And we have to make that distinction again, which is the most important distinction, is and a lot of the bad things we talked about religion, it's things done in the name of religion. It's individuals doing it against their religion, against Christianity, for example. But for a lot of these good things, obviously it is people doing it in the name of their religion a lot of the time, or in the name of Christianity. But they did it because of what's written in the Bible. They did it because of their religious beliefs, and they by doing these good deeds and, well, creating science and hospitals and whatever, they're doing what their religion told them to, whilst Christians doing the Inquisition and killing off Native Americans, that was against their religion. Even though they said it was for their religion, it was against Christianity. And any person that, if you have a Bible and you have time to read and you read some of the New Testament, you'll find out very quickly, or the Old Testament, whatever, you'll find out very quickly that what they did was against their religion. And these good things, ending slavery, women's rights, etc., was following the teachings of Jesus in many ways.
I think really a very simplistic conclusion can be made from what we have spoken about is when something is done in the name of a religion, the question that should be asked is, does these religious traditions, does these religious scriptures actually advocate for these actions that these people are doing in its name? If so, then that could be bad. Do you agree with that rough conclusion?
Yeah. And if they do it against their religion, it's like if they do act against Christianity, for example, and they call themselves Christians, they're acting as individuals using different reasons for their evil actions, using bad reasons.
Yeah, again, not all religions are true. There's only one true faith, and that is Christianity.
Thank you for listening. I hope you liked it. We had a lot of fun again, and we'll have another interesting topic to talk about.